This week, I want to give you a few different matchups and ask you who you think would win in a fight. All right. The first one is the Incredible Hulk and Wolverine, two superheroes from the Marvel Universe. Which one do you think would win in a fight? All right. Next, we'll go with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and John Cena, two guys who have wrestled and who are also acting now. Who do you think would win in a fight between those two? All right, next let's go with Gollum from Lord of the Rings and Dobby from Harry Potter. Who do you think would win in a fight between those two? All right, and the last one, let's go with the Kool-Aid Man and Chuck Norris. Who do you think would win in a fight between Chuck Norris and the Kool-Aid Man? My guess is that as you chose who you think would win in a fight in all those matchups, you chose the person that you think is strongest, right? Or at the very least, you didn't choose the person who you think is the weakest in many regards, right? And not just in terms of fights, but in many areas of our life, we don't typically think of being weak as a good thing, right? None of us want to be weak. When we feel weak, when we do things that demonstrate our weakness in some area, we typically don't like that feeling. We typically don't like those moments. This week, as we continue our series on how we relate to God, I want us to think about this idea of weakness, and we're going to look at a passage that helps us to see how we can kind of be flipped on its head. How weakness is not a bad thing, but can actually be an important way for us to relate to God. So I'm going to read a passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Paul writes this: "So to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong.'" See, as we've talked about how we relate to God so far, we talked about what it means to be made in his image, how we are valued and special simply because of that fact. We talked about how if we are in Christ, we are a new creation. The old has passed away, the new has come, so we can relate to God not only as his creation, but as a new creation in him. We talked about what it means to relate to God by having faith in his future grace, not just looking backwards with faith in his what he's done for us in the past, with gratitude for his past grace, but also trusting in his future grace that he can show us. We talked about what it means to be a child of God, that if we have been adopted by him, that changes entirely our access we have to come to him freely. That changes the relationship that we can have with him foundationally. We talked about what it means to abide in Jesus, to not just simply come to him to recharge every now and then, but what it means to remain in him, like a branch connected to the vine, and how we can relate to him that way. This week, as we talk about weakness, we're going to see how we can relate to God in our weakness. How when we experience weakness, when we understand that we are weak, we can relate to God because of those things, not in spite of them. What we see here in this passage is that Paul was experiencing some form of weakness. He says that he was given a thorn in the flesh, and commentators and scholars have different views on exactly what that meant. It could have been some kind of physical affliction, could have been something different. But whatever it is, he asked God 3 times, he says. He says, "I pleaded with the Lord to remove this from me." And God said, "No." God said, "No, because my grace is sufficient for you." What I think is really important for us to understand here is that weakness is not something that God necessarily saves us from. It doesn't necessarily save us from every affliction we have, every illness, every time that we feel physically weak. It doesn't save us from every area of our lives where we experience weakness and we fail at things. But instead that this weakness is something that is a part of our lives, in part because we live in a sinful world, right? In part because of our choices, the choices of others, because of the broken world that we live in. Weakness is a part of our reality. And in part because as we'll see, weakness is something that can help us relate to God in a better way. So if he were simply to just remove it, we would miss out on something. We would miss out on what he could do through that weakness. You see, instead of God telling Paul, okay, I'll take this away, you've really prayed earnestly about it, it would really, you really love for this weakness to be gone. Instead, God tells Paul that his power is made perfect in weakness. Now, this is a really interesting statement, right? We don't usually think of power being present in weakness, right? Those fighters we had lined up earlier, if one of them came down with the flu and was suddenly sick and really weak and stuck in bed, we wouldn't think, oh yeah, they're really powerful now. Yeah. So what does it mean that God's power is made perfect in weakness? That's an important question I want you to hold on to as we continue to work through this, and we'll circle back to that. And then because of God's response to Paul, because Paul asked God, remove this from me, God says, no, my power is made perfect in weakness. My grace is sufficient for you. And what I have to offer is enough to handle your weakness. Paul then can boast in his weakness. He can be content with it. He can see his weakness as a good thing. This is a totally different shift, right? To understand weakness and failure and this deficiency, this lack as a good thing. And I think it's because of how he relates to God in his weakness. You see, Paul is not just saying, this thing that I've asked God to take away, all of a sudden now it's a good thing. Oh yeah, I realized it wasn't all that bad. Instead, what I think he is understanding is that because God has communicated to him that he will work in that weakness, that he will work through it, that he has grace to show Paul, that Paul can see this as a situation where he can relate to God in a new and better way because of his weakness, not kind of in spite of it. And so then because of that, he can be happy that this is a part of his life, right? We might think of it this way, that there are times in our lives when we go through struggles, when we go through hard times. And sometimes those hard times bring us closer to God, right? Because we spend more time praying, we spend more time asking him to help us, we spend more time in his word, and we can even grow closer to other people who might support us throughout that time. Now, we wouldn't look at those hard times, those struggles, and say, yeah, actually it was good. It was good that I was going through that difficulty. That thing was good. But good things could come out of it, and we could be actually thankful in a way for that time of weakness, that time of struggle. As we think about how we relate to God in our weakness, I think it's really important for us to understand how did Jesus demonstrate this, right? How did Jesus, as he came on earth to be among us and live as a human being, how did he demonstrate relating to God in his weakness? And how did he experience and demonstrate weakness while he was here? So I want you to take a moment to pause the video and to reflect on that question. How did Jesus experience weakness? How did he demonstrate weakness while he was here on earth? And then we'll come back together after that. I think of many ways that Jesus experienced weakness, that he demonstrated weakness when he was here on earth. I think of times the Bible talks about him being hungry or being thirsty or being tired or weary, right? Even just those regular physical weakness times that all of us experience as people, not even when we're necessarily sick or anything, but simply those periods of weakness Jesus experienced. Jesus demonstrated weakness by being gentle, by not always fighting back, right? By turning the other cheek. And in the next chapter, after this passage we've already looked at, so in 2 Corinthians chapter 13, Paul talks about Jesus and his weakness in a certain way. So let's read 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 3 and 4. Paul says, "Since you seek proof that Christ is speaking in me, he is not weak in dealing with you, but is powerful among you. For he was crucified in weakness, but lives by the power of God. For we also are weak in him, but in dealing with you, we will live with him by the power of God." So how did Jesus demonstrate his weakness? In those ways that we've already mentioned, right? He demonstrated weakness by being hungry, thirsty, tired, by being emotionally burnt out, that he needed time to get away from people, right? He needed some time for his weakness to subside. But ultimately, he demonstrates his weakness in his death on the cross, right? Think about this. If Jesus is who he says he is, if he is God, if he is infinite and all-powerful, then he is the one in whom there should be no weakness, right? If weakness is the opposite of power and strength, then Jesus, as the one who is all-powerful, who can do anything, who has all might and ability, should have no weakness. But in a turn of events, Jesus humbles himself, comes to earth to become one of us, to put himself in our shoes, to live as a human being who has weakness, who has need, who has lack. And then to ultimately, as the king of the universe, not to demand that throne through power or strength or might, but to lay down his life willingly as a sacrifice on a cross, demonstrating that weakness is not something that is the opposite of strength, but that it is actually something that can lead to living by God's power. See, Paul said that Jesus was crucified in his weakness so that he could live by the power of God. That living by God's power in his weakness is how Jesus demonstrated what this can look like for us. See, when Paul said that he asked God to remove this affliction from him, God said, "No, my grace is sufficient, for my power is made perfect in weakness." This is what God was pointing to, right? That it's through humble sacrifice, that it's through what appears to be weak, that it's through what appears to be the opposite of strong and mighty, that God demonstrates his true power, that God demonstrates his power over sin, his power over death, his power over the ways of the world by working through weakness. And he can do the same thing in our own lives, right? He can work through our weakness to show us his power that's available for us in our lives now. Now, every week we think about these different ways that we relate to God, and we come to this question, right? How do we relate to God because of this thing? So this week we want to ask, well, how do we relate to God in our weakness? And ultimately, I think the first thing is that when we understand our weakness and our inability to save ourselves, right? Because if we are in sin, if we are unable to save ourselves, and that's weakness we have, we're unable to do that, that's a failing we have. When we understand our weakness and our inability to save ourselves, we can understand how God's grace is enough for us. We can understand how God can cover our weakness, how he can fill that gap. I want to share a little bit about my own story with you, because this is something that I've had to learn and experience over my life, of how I was unable to save myself. See, I grew up in a Christian home. I grew up in the church, and for the majority of my time until I was in high school, I trusted in Jesus. I had put my faith in him, but it really didn't make much of a difference. I was just kind of a good kid. I was like a good Christian boy, right? I went to church, I went to youth group and Sunday school. I went to a Christian private school for elementary school. I didn't really do anything that was wrong. I just kind of did things that were good and right, but following Jesus, relating to him, wasn't something that was really an impactful thing in my life. And it was in my time in high school and my time shortly after high school, my first few years of college, that I really understood how I could not save myself, how I couldn't just through my own effort do everything that I needed to do. One moment in particular really stands out. It was my first year at Nyack, the college that I attended just over the border in New York. And when I first came to Nyack, I had been dating someone for just about a year. And this was the person that I thought I was going to marry. I thought I was going to marry this girl. And throughout our relationship up to that time, we had not had any fights. That might sound really great, right? Oh, we were awesome. We were able to kind of keep things together, right? Just kind of keep going forward, doing good on our own. But when that relationship ultimately broke down, for several reasons, I saw my inability to do everything right. You know, I had understood that I wasn't perfect, that I had sin in my life, but I could pretty much for the most part, do what was right, what was good. I had done well in school. I had done well socially with friends and in different activities I had done. But this moment when I saw, for the first time really, my inability to, just out of my own effort, keep something going good, right? I thought it was going well, and then all of a sudden it wasn't. I saw my need for God. I saw my weakness. And through that, I understood more and more about my need for God's grace, right? His gift of life and his ability to cover my sin, to cover my weakness, to cover my inability, to work through that. My hope and my prayer for you would be that you would experience the same thing. That you would be able to see in your own life your weakness and your inability not as a downer or a negative, but as something that would motivate you then to turn to God and to see that his grace is sufficient for you, that his power is made perfect in our weakness. See, the next way that we can relate to God in our weakness is that we have to trust God in his power to make us strong, not ourselves. As we understand our weakness, as that turns us to God, it helps us to trust him and not ourselves to make us strong. See, especially in our culture, we have this idea that we just have to work hard, right? Just kind of motivate yourself, just kind of push ahead and do what's right and really have a strong work ethic, and you will make something out of yourself, right? That's kind of like the American dream in some way. It's, people who are able to come here and through hard work and dedication and sacrifice to improve themselves, to improve their lives. And many of you probably have a similar mindset in terms of your school, in terms of your athletics or your music, your drama, in terms of the future that you want to have for yourself. We have these ideas that we work hard, right? That we just kind of put our nose down, focus, stay going the right way, and good things will result, right? But ultimately, what the Bible shows us is that in all of our good effort, in all of the things that we can and should do, we ultimately can't make ourselves strong, that we are still weak and unable to save ourselves. And so therefore, when we know that we have this weakness, when we don't try to hide it or run away from it, but when we embrace it and allow it to bring us to God, we have to trust him to make us strong and not ourselves. And as our focus turns from ourselves and our weakness, our inabilities and our deficiencies, we turn from focusing on those and trying to just work harder to get rid of those ourselves. When our focus then turns to God, to his grace, to his power, and to his ability to make us strong, when we turn and focus on him, then we relate to him with our eyes focused on him, with our eyes not focused on ourselves, not focused on our lack, but instead focused on him and his grace and his power, his ability to make us strong, his ability to work in our lives in ways that we can't do on our own, knowing that he gives us the example of experiencing that weakness as well, of actually saving us through an act of weakness in a way. Relating to God in our weakness is something that is really important for us to understand, because all of us are weak in one way or another, and really in many ways, if we think about it. All of us are unable to save ourselves, and so none of us can make ourselves strong. None of us can fill every gap we have in our lives. But when we turn to God and trust him and keep our eyes focused on him, allow his grace to be sufficient, allow him to make us strong, then we can really relate to him in a new and exciting way. See, when we understand our weakness and our inability, we can relate to God through his grace and power and allow him to make us strong. We can relate to him kind of free from the burden of trying to cover our own weakness. We can relate to him free from the need to work harder and harder to make ourselves strong enough to be with him, because he welcomes us in weak and broken as we are. As we reflect on this idea of relating to God in our weakness, I want you to find some paper clips, if you have them in your house, or something else that you could bend and break easily. Think of paper clips because they remind me of, links in a chain. I don't know if you've ever made like that kind of chain link necklace or something out of paper clips. But compared to like a real rope, compared to a real chain, they're weak, right? What I want you to do is find something, either paperclip or something like that you could bend and break, and then to bend and break it. And as you do that, I want you to reflect on the weaknesses that you have in your life, to reflect on the failures, the struggles, the flaws, the areas that you know that you are weak, that you can clearly see that. And as you fidget with the paperclip, right, bending and breaking it and feeling the weakness that it has compared to real chains or a real rope, I want you to spend some time praying and asking God to show you how His grace can cover your weakness, to ask you how He can show that His grace is sufficient, how He can have His power be made perfect in your weakness, how He can make you strong. Because all of us are weak, but that can be a way for us to relate to God, not something we have to kind of climb over and get past before we can relate to Him. Lord, we thank you for your example of weakness being strength. Your example that the deficiencies, the lack we have are not a hurdle between us and you, but that they are actually a way that you can work in our lives. I pray that you would help us to know where we're weak, where we fail, where we have flaws, and where we're deficient. And I pray that you would help those to be things that turn us to you, that we would focus on you and your grace, your power, your ability to make us strong. And I pray that now as we reflect and ask you to do that, that you would meet us in our weakness. And we thank you that you are a God who wants to meet us there in our weakness. I pray these things in your name. Amen.